So when I was young, around between 6 and 8, I started showing a lot of interest in music. And my mom got me one of those little toy pianos that sound horrible. And I don't know, it's got like 20 keys or something like that. But I obsessively played it nonstop. And I just played and played and played and played all the time. And what she didn't understand was I was telling stories. The keys, the lower keys were, the monster coming out of the woods, and the upper keys were the princess running through the woods sort of thing. And I had whole storylines I was developing as I played this toy piano. And I just wouldn't give it up. And I kept doing more and more of it. And that's also around the time I finally starting to figure out how to read. I really struggled. I didn't know this, but my whole family suffers from dyslexia. So I think in my own way, I was figuring out how to get around the issues of reading and just tracking across a page and the words and everything like that. I didn't know what I was doing, but I started to look at words as drawings. And that was my brain's way of kind of getting around it. So I started showing all this interest in drawing and reading and playing music. And finally, my mom probably was driven nuts by the toy piano sound. And she went and got an actual piano. And then the next thing I knew, I was taking piano lessons. And that was really huge for me because I really enjoyed it. Music came so naturally. Writing my own songs came so naturally. Just writing in general came naturally. I also started to write stories. So from a very young age, I wanted to be a writer. So once I discovered books, I just took off into this imaginary world, and I was voracious. It was crazy. My mom would take me to the library, and I'd get 20 books at a time. I read, anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 pages a day. And, by the time I was in 4th grade, I was at college level reading comprehension. So it was really a huge escape, partially because I was so bullied. I was a weird kid. I was that skinny, weird kid at the school that everyone picked on. And it became a massive escape to be able to go into these fantasy worlds. And I was really obsessed with like science fiction and fantasy. That was the two. I wasn't into horror. I wasn't into, anything else. I wanted fantasy more than anything. I wanted to leave the world I was in. So I think that was key for my creative development because it was all in my mind. I was reading all these books and I was imagining creatures and landscapes and aliens and all these things. And it was really formative as far as, I was just imagining these things. I didn't have a lot of input as far as fantasy stuff because my parents were very worried about TV and its influence and movies and all that stuff. So I didn't get to see a lot. I mean, I saw some, we went to the movies once in a while, and I remember seeing Escape from Witch Mountain really stuck in my head. Disney movies, I think that was the craziest or the raciest it ever got was the Disney movie playing at the Dollar Theater down the street. And I really remember seeing Star Wars. That was like a huge thing. But it was an interesting balance in the household in that my parents didn't want to tell me I couldn't do art and music and drawing and all these things. But at the same time, it was their worst nightmare to have a creative child. It was very interesting because across the street was a family whose daughter had no interest in anything creative whatsoever, and they were both ex-dancers and everything. And the parents would joke they should swap kids because my parents wanted somebody like that who just wanted to, get a job and have a family and, have a normal life. And I kept doing creative things. So it was an interesting time when I was a kid because I knew they didn't want me to do these things, but at the same time, they didn't stop me. And they did provide me with lessons and access, but they weren't there at every concert. They didn't show up to the concerts. They weren't interested in having anything to do with anything. They had no idea what I was doing in band or, those sort of things. So I started playing piano, and then I started playing clarinet in 4th grade. And it just kind of went from there. I kept picking up instruments. And I kept drawing and I kept writing, and I won several like young writer sort of competitions and awards and stuff like that. I never thought of myself as doing anything but writing, because I was so successful at it at such an early age. So that's how I started out, was that I had no idea about makeup. I loved Halloween. I loved, dressing up for Halloween and becoming someone else, but it was all still tied all together in that whole fantasy element, just becoming someone else, being in a different world. Anything like that I was very interested in. I wanted to escape my world, which was, a bullied kid in the wrong side of town. So when I was 12, going on into, switching over to like 8th grade and high school, things like that, I continued with the music. I got better and better at clarinet. And I continued my writing, and that's what I focused on, was writing and clarinet, and, just surviving school. I think I was socially very awkward. I was very shy. Both my parents were introverts. My dad's a mechanical engineer. My mom should have been a mechanical engineer, but she was instead a frustrated housewife who was way too smart for her own good. She's off the charts intelligent, but, she stayed home with us, and I didn't realize how spoiled I was at all. We were kept away from other kids. We didn't really interact with other kids or stay over at other kids' houses. So I had no idea that my mom was, being a super mom, and that she was constantly taking us to museums, constantly letting us be creative, do things, kind of, like I said, not exactly encouraging us, but not stopping us in any way. Oh, you want some paint? Okay, we're going to go get paint, that sort of thing. But in high school, I started to really get into, music, and it was the first, being in band, I think, was the first time I had social interaction, really. I had friends for the first, the real friends for the first time. I mean, I had friends in grade school, but it was just more social, and that was huge. And it was funny because I just, here I am, clarinet player, started playing saxophone. It was very much the typical high school band thing. But when I was 16 or 17, I was sick. I got a very bad flu. And it was one of those ones where my temperature was off the charts. It was like 104 or something like that. And it just kept climbing. And my aunt, we were visiting my grandmother, and my aunt, who's a nurse, actually came home to take care of me because, they were putting me in cold baths and doing everything they could to keep my temperature down. And I had never seen MTV. I had no idea what MTV was, or, none of it. I'd never seen a video in my life. Again, very sheltered, not exposed to a lot of different music. I mean, I'd been exposed to music and band, and then my mom played 1950s tunes at home. That was it. Or neighborhood music. But I just really had no access to any sort of media. And it was interesting because here I am, and I'm watching MTV for the first time in my mind, and I'm completely out of my mind with a fever. And I'm like, I to this day remember the lineup. It was like Def Leppard, Pour Some Sugar on Me. And then it was Paradise City by Guns N' Roses. And it was Ragdoll by Aerosmith. And I was just like, I want to play rock and roll. And that was a problem because, I'm 17 and my parents were not going to be all about me doing the rock and roll thing. But, I wanted to be a drummer. Suddenly I was like, that is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I want to play drums. And my parents were like, not until you're 18. So I turned 18 and I bought a drum set and I started playing drums. And it was really good for me because here I was, this horribly shy, backwards person, and all of a sudden I'm the only female drummer that, a lot of people have ever seen. And I got a lot of attention and stuff like that. So it was really good for building confidence and stuff. And I really got into it. I played drums for 10 years, and, I was a nerd, so I got into all the technical aspects of it. And, it was a really fun time. So that was my high school, was this metamorphosis from me being this good little clarinet player into this drummer with torn up clothes, playing CD clubs all over town. So it was kind of a fun transition from there into college. So I graduated from high school, and I think I was a typical kid. I had the day job, working at the local drugstore, and then trying to get into college. And I started going to community college, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I started playing, drums and bands. And, the next thing I knew, I was singing in bands. And that wasn't entirely voluntary. That was more the band members talking me into it. And I suddenly was a front person in a band, and we were playing clubs, and we were during that whole funk rock era, so it was a lot of fun, and all the drama that bands have. I started to think I was cursed because every time we recorded I'd get in a band, and we'd get to the point where we were doing really well, and we'd record, and of course we'd break up in the studio every single time. I was like, no, and I'd start over, get a new band, do it, get to recording. And of course there'd be half the time I wasn't even involved. It was just like, some big explosion in the studio every time. So that was going, and I was getting into computer animation. I was interning at a computer animation studio in San Francisco. But I also started to get into performance installation art. I took a class in college, which was performance installation art, and it was just a big light went off in my head. And I had been working towards an engineering degree, which would have made my dad very, very happy. And I slowly broke my parents in. I switched to an English major. Okay, well, there's still hope. Maybe I could be a writer or something respectable. And then I switched to creative arts major. And that was like my full rebellion there was when I switched to creative arts. Because what do you do with creative arts? I mean, even the program doesn't know what to do with you. Like, even the college is like, here's a tin cup. Sorry, So, but I got into performance installation art. I started performing in San Francisco and being invited to perform different places. And what I was doing was this weird mix. Again, I had no formal art training, really. I was totally sneaking into art classes because as a creative arts major, you could. So I was taking drawing, I was taking painting, all this stuff, but I was not in the major. And I was totally like sneaking around, taking classes I shouldn't have been taking, but I could get away with it because I was a creative arts major. And I don't know, performance installation art just like was the thing. I thought, that was what it was going to be, and I was very successful at it, and I loved it. It was building sets and then performing in the sets, and then I was doing my own makeup, and I started getting into costuming, and it was just everything I wanted to do. It was all this. I had never been a theater kid. I'd never been anywhere near acting or theater, so it was all these things I loved about theater, but it was taken out of the traditional way of theater. And you could do anything, and you could make a whole world. So again, here I was trying to make my dream of making other worlds come true. I was decorating these rooms and creating these creatures and creating these storylines in a very avant-garde, weird arts way. And I loved it. I was obsessed. And I started to kind of drift away from writing. Again, I was also a dual major in that I did writing, creative writing as my thing. And I was getting really pressured to publish or at least submit, and it freaked me out because I think for me writing was the closest thing to my heart, and I didn't want to get rejected. So I started focusing more on performance installation art, all the meanwhile developing an IT career on the side because computers were just easy. So I was this hot mess. Like I didn't know any artists really other than the people I knew in school. My family was all mechanical engineers and machinists and aircraft repair people. I was just in totally uncharted territory, and my parents didn't know what to do with this hot mess of a kid coming out of college with an art degree who had no idea what to do with the art degree. But whatever I put my mind to, I was doing okay with. So it was this, families just don't know what to do. I mean, I wasn't an illustrator. There's a clear route for illustration. There's a clear route for if you're an actor, or a clear route if you're a costume or set designer. But there's no route if you're this multimedia artist. There's no path. And, I was so glad I found a school that had a creative arts degree that understood there are some people that are just a mishmash of all the things all at once. We're a generalist. We're not good at any one thing. We're good at multiple things, kind of. So in a world of specialists, which America is obsessed with specialists, I was not a specialist. I was a generalist, and I didn't know what to do with myself. So my college years were very tumultuous in that I didn't know where to go with a career or how to make a living or how to continue on past the school thing without moving. And that was the other thing that was happening. I was engaged to be married. And, I had multiple professors going, you need to move to LA or New York and you will be a hit. You're doing stuff it's like you've already got a master's. Just go do it. We'll write letters. We'll help you get into galleries, whatever. You're really talented. Go do it. And it would require me to leave the relationship, and I was scared. So I didn't. And I stayed in the Bay Area where I grew up and instead became an IT person working for a manufacturing company. So I got out of college. I got a job working for this manufacturing company, and it was chemical manufacturing, and I learned a lot about manufacturing and business and all that stuff. And I became like the IT person / database person. And I found a new skill that I had, which is databases were super easy for me. Again, I'd had no formal computer training, but the next thing I knew, I was a West Coast systems engineer. I had no formal database training, and the next thing I knew, I rolled out a database to the entire country. So certain types of things came very easily to me, but then I struggled with other things. Like I've always struggled with math. But I wasn't happy. I was every night I would play in bands and we would moonlight playing gigs on the weekends and stuff like that. I kept doing that. And then I found, totally by accident, I walked through a haunted house one Halloween and I'd been wearing my costume that I had from work. Basically, I dressed up for work, the office party or whatever. And I said, I'm just going to go. So I went by myself. I went to the haunted house, and I had never been to one. I was very curious. I like spooky things. And walking through, everyone kept yelling at me to go back to my spot. And I was like, I don't understand. This is not scary. Why is everyone telling me to go back to my room? And finally, security accosted me, and they were like, you need to go back to your spot right now. And I was like, what are you talking about? And then they realized, you're a customer. And I'm like, yeah, I'm a customer. And they were like, well, your makeup and costume were so good, we assumed you were working the vampire room. And I was like, no, I'm just, and they were like, well, do you want to work here? And I was like, is that a possibility? He was like, come back tomorrow night. So I did. I started acting, and I went nuts. It was performance installation art on a large scale. This was at the time one of the largest haunted houses in the world. So it was, just room after room of people doing these costume, makeup, set. It was performance art. It was exactly my degree, and I dove in with both feet. But I never did anything past Halloween. I just did that period where I told my job, I was like, I'm skating out of here at 4:30 every day or 2:30, and I'm going to go to work at the haunted house. So I started doing construction. I started doing set design. I started doing my own makeup and stuff like that because I didn't like some of, it was so rushed. And the next thing I knew, I was on the makeup team. So that was my moonlighting, like my once a year creative purge. And then, that would happen. And then I'd go back to my little world of typing, punching, hiding in a closet, doing IT things. And, occasionally moonlighting with the band and stuff like that. I kept doing bands the whole time. This whole time I've been doing different iterations of bands. So I never slept. I just stayed up all night playing in bands or rehearsing or, coming up with crazy haunt characters. But that was my life for a good 7, 8 years. I just got these little creative fixes because I didn't know what else to do as an artist. I didn't know that you could make a living doing any of these things. I didn't know where to go or how to get into it. Well, my late 20s, I started getting really tired of working in the corporate world. I was offered a very high-paying position, and that's when it finally struck me that I needed to think about what I wanted to do with my life. And, I could have been very highly paid corporate executive, and I turned it down to everyone's surprise. And I turned it down because I realized I still wanted to do art more than anything, even though my parents were like, that's a bad idea. Everyone around me, that's a bad idea. I just, and especially living in the San Francisco Bay Area, you're so worried about money all the time and just making enough to live, just have a roof over your head is such a struggle. But I wanted to do creative things, and I wasn't, when I got that job offer, I realized I wasn't quite ready to give up on my dream of being some form of artist. I didn't know what kind of artist. I didn't know what it was. So when I was around 27, I went through a lot of personal turmoil in that the band I was in was taking off and doing really well. And it was like, wow, finally I'm in a band where we're playing bigger festivals, and it's the kind of music I want to be doing, because it sounds crazy. So often in bands, I was in bands, I didn't really enjoy the music. It's just so hard to get 5 or 6 people going the same direction as it is. You kind of make a lot of sacrifices on what you're doing just because, just getting people going in the same direction is hard enough. So, the band was doing well, and, the job was immensely stressful. I was in this super high stress job, and I had a lot of responsibility, and there's a lot of turmoil at work too. And then I ended up getting a divorce. And when I asked for a divorce, he threw everything I owned out on the street. I came back and my stuff was scattered across half the street, and I was like, wow, I'm technically homeless. All of a sudden, in one day, I went from, having a decent paid corporate job and married and all these things, and the next day I was homeless. And, kind of living the band life. So I ended up crashing on the floors of different band members and friends, and being homeless for a while until I could build up the pay to, get my own place, which in the Bay Area is, people don't understand what a challenge that is, that to save up a month or two of rent and the deposit and it was super expensive. So I was working the whole time, and I saw the movie Fight Club. And for some reason, that movie just really spoke to me, especially the scene where he holds a gun to the guy's head and asks him what he wants to be. He has to answer, and he wants to be a veterinarian. And he goes, why are you working at a Quickie Mart or whatever it was? And it just really hit me. I was like, what am I doing with my life? Why aren't I doing more creative things? Why am I, just getting by with this corporate job? And I just redoubled my efforts into the music, and ended up having a really rich, rewarding band experience, where we toured around and we did so much, and had a great time. And I ended up getting remarried to the bass player in the band. We got very close during that time, and the band then broke up. And it was the same thing. The guitarist had a thing where he had to move, and, next thing the drummer had a thing, and the band was done. And my husband at the time got an offer to move to Oregon for a job. And he had been largely, typical bass player, largely unemployed for huge swaths of time. And it was really wearing on a relationship. And I was like, yes, let's go to Portland, Oregon. I didn't want to go to Portland. I wanted to go to Seattle, where all the cool stuff was happening, because, outside of Oregon, you don't know what's here. You don't know that there's anything going on. But I heard, the call of him having a job wherever we could go to get that happening. So we moved to Portland, Oregon. But little did I know, Portland, Oregon had the art scene that I'd always hoped for. And all of a sudden, I was surrounded by all these creative people doing creative things, and it was very exciting and kind of like what I always dreamed of, is being around other artists and installation artists and people. And my marriage broke up again, and I just was in this really cool time in that I was like, I have a chance to do it. I have a chance to, I'm not tied down by family or anything. It's like, I'm here in Portland. What am I going to do? So I got involved in a group called Sunday Night Special. They were this avant-garde, rogue performance art group that would roam about doing weird things in town. And I was like, okay, I'm finally here. I'm finally doing the kind of stuff I want to do. I still had a job, doing database design and all that. But weekends and nights and weekends, I was moonlighting, doing this cool stuff. And I was starting to feel more alive than I'd ever felt, in that I was going the right direction. But again, I never saw a way to make money or to make a career out of any of this. This was all, guerrilla style, goofy art stuff, very Portland. I will not admit to spray painting anything. There might have been really cool stencils spray painted on stuff. I don't know who did it. Anyways, it was really fun, but it wasn't focused either, though. It was a madcap group, and I appreciated it. My music career, I started playing bass and singing in a few bands, and ended up in a crazy metal band that was really making fun of everything. But again, I started getting tired of all the drama and all the crazy. The drummer that doesn't show up because they're in jail or drunk. I just wanted to do something, anything. And I fell into movies in the most ridiculous way. So I have a friend that called me up and said, hey, I have a music video. Do you want to come help? The makeup artist doesn't want to do the blood, and I want drips of blood. And I was like, you do haunted house stuff? And I was like, yeah, I'd continue to do haunted house stuff even in Portland, Oregon. I, got more and more involved with local haunted houses here, and it was a great, again, outlet for 1 month out of the year. So I went and I did this music video, and it was super fun. I was like, this is great. This is, it makes sense to me, the organization, but the creativity / organization. I was like, this is cool. This is kind of appealing to both sides of my brain. And the makeup artist was like, you have half a brain. You want to come with me the next shoot? I'm double booked. I'm like, sure. I was taking a hiatus from work at the moment. And, I said, yeah, that sounds fun. So went to the next set and was there for 3 days. And I was like, the first thing that hit me after being on, it was like, where was this when I was 20? Because I would have went to this like a duck to water. It made so much sense to me. The film set made sense to me. The combination of creativity and technical was just something that really struck a chord in me. We were making stories and we were making fantasy. And I was like, where has this been all my life? I had no idea this was a thing. Because I think in the Bay Area, there wasn't big film shooting. It was all, people shot in San Francisco once in a while, but there was no, I never knew anyone that worked in the movies. I thought that was all far away in LA. So I started doing little short films and started doing stuff. Actually, that makeup artist called me 2 weeks later and she goes, go buy a makeup kit. You're on a movie. And I was like, I don't know how to do makeup. What are you talking about? I helped you for 3 days. I don't know how to do makeup. She goes, you'll figure it out. So I spent the next 2 weeks in Washington faking my way. Oh yes, I'm a makeup artist. Let me powder your nose. I didn't know what I was doing. And, but they kept asking me, can I bash someone's head in with a rock? Well, I knew enough from haunted house makeup and stuff to figure it out. And hey, can you slit this guy's throat, or can you cut this guy's ear off? Not knowing I was trying more advanced effects, no idea. I was just like, oh, I think I can do that. I think if I make a copy of the ear and then I do this, and so it was all just figuring out. And this is all before YouTube, where you could just go online and somebody tells you how to do it. Is way before then. I had nothing. I had a book from Tap Plastics, I think, on how to make molds. And that's all I had. I didn't have makeup books. I just had what I learned at the haunted house, though. And, that sort of thing. And I just tried to make it look better than haunted house makeup. I tried to make it look more like what I saw on film. So directors started recommending me the other directors, and I started moonlighting. I did that for 5 years, where I did my IT database job. And then at nights and weekends, I ran around and was doing these little short films and learning. Basically, Portland paid for my makeup education. And I was honest with people. I was like, I don't know how to make a severed head. I'll try, And it just, buy some materials and figure it out. And I started I went down to LA on a big trip. And this was a big eye opener for me. I went down to LA. I went to the makeup artist trade show down there called IMATS, International Makeup Artist Trade Show. And that was just a huge aha moment for me, because I'm walking around and all these people, this is their job. This is their profession, making monsters and creatures and stuff like that. And I go and I watched all the applications, and I was like, okay, this makes sense to me, what they're doing. And I, looked at the products, and I asked someone if I could shadow them. So I stayed down there. Like, I came back down. I followed them around for like 2 weeks. And I saw the mold making and saw how shops worked. And I was like, this is cool. I think I want to do this. And it was the first time in my life where I was like, I actually saw a route to doing something creative. I'd always been in these amorphous fine art circles. And the music thing was starting to fade out. As far as I was getting older. I was getting tired of jumping around on stage, and I was just like, maybe my time for that is done. I realized I wasn't a young chicken anymore, and probably the music thing wasn't going to be what I wanted it to be. And I just didn't have time with film. Film overtook my entire life. Like, every waking moment other than being at work was dealing with film stuff. And I was like, I can't do all three. So I quit the band, and I started to focus on makeup. But when I was down in LA, I had some pretty harsh things said to me. Women don't do well in this industry. You'll never amount to anything. You're just like all the other girls that come down here who want to do stuff, and you won't go anywhere. And that made me so angry that I went, this is not how this conversation is going to end. I went and I dropped like $4,000 on makeup materials at the makeup store, and I drove it all back up to Portland. I unloaded and went, okay, I got to figure it out. So I started in earnest chasing the concept of opening a special effects makeup studio and becoming a special effects makeup artist or film makeup artist, just whatever it took to be in the film industry. So that's where, somehow. And then, it was very tough. It was definitely a side gig. It was a side hustle. And we went through the recession, and that side hustle got bigger and bigger because I needed the money just to support the family. My husband lost his job, and I wasn't able to, we weren't doing well. So I started pushing the film stuff more and more, all while doing the day job. And then one day I got a call for a TV show in town called Grimm. And they were wondering if I wanted to be a makeup assistant. And I was like, sure. Because I realized, what was the chances of a monster-based show on a major network coming to little old Portland, Oregon? What was the chances of that happening again? In the history of the town and all the filming, nothing like that had ever happened. So I started doing Grimm. And what a lot of people didn't realize, I was still working my IT job while working on Grimm. I was just taking days off. And but after about a year and a half, I got too many days on Grimm, and it started getting more and more. I started getting more and more days, and I just couldn't do everything. So then I made the terrifying decision. It was probably the scariest thing I'd ever done in my life, which was quit my job and do Grimm full time. And Grimm wasn't full time. That's the thing. As people don't realize, special effects makeup artists, regular makeup artists are there every single day. They're making a regular paycheck. They're making regular time, hours, all that stuff. Special effects, you're only there when they have a creature, when they have something special. So a lot of times out of 10 days on an episode or 8 days, you're only there 2 days or 3 days. And you have to somehow survive and make it through to the next episode where you get 2 or 3 days. So you're making anywhere from half to, like a third of what other people are making on the show. And that was tough. That was tough because, trying to make it get by, chase, the starving artist thing started to really hit me. I wonder if my parents were right. But I loved what I was doing, and I was working with the most amazing mentors in the world. I just really was getting passionate about what I was doing. And I also realized that in the little microcosm of a small town, you can think you're all that because, I'm the best person in town. And then you have this person come in who's been doing it for 30 years. And then you realize you don't know anything. And that's where Grimm was great. It really just knocked me back on my heels and made me realize there was so much to learn. And if I was going to get good at this, I better start learning. So it lit a fire under me to start buying more materials and start researching more and start learning and trying to do stuff in my shop. And I, spent a lot of nights by myself crying, going, why isn't the mold come apart? But I I don't know, it just all made sense to me. And it was such a lovely blend of creative and technical. And I think that's the problem I was having in life. I was meandering all over the place, because if I was just a painter or just a thing, I'd be miserable. But I needed that mechanical and technical challenge combined with the creative. And I wasn't able to find it in any other field. And I always, got into stuff maybe a year or two, and then I'd kind of change to something else. This was the first thing I really stuck with. And it was like, I passed year 5. I was like, wait, I'm still doing this. Isn't this around the time I quit and start a whole new hobby? Oh, wait, it's year 6 and I'm still doing it. So that was something I was like, I must really like this stuff. But it's interesting meeting makeup artists, because they just assume I've been doing this my whole life. They assume I'd been doing this since a young age or whatever, and I haven't. And the other thing was, most makeup artists I'm competing against, they've been doing monsters in their bedroom since they were 12. Their parents were buying them clay at the age of 12, and they've been doing this for a long time. Jumping into this at the age of 34 was definitely intimidating, but it also lit a huge fire under my butt, because I felt like I had to catch up. I had to work so hard to catch up with all these people. And so it's kind of helped me and hurt me too, because people are like, you're tired all the time. You're always doing 5 gigs at once. You're always overbooked. I'm like, but I don't know how else to catch up. I don't know how else to get to a level I need to get to. It is a race against time in the film industry. The film industry is horribly ageist. And unless you're at a certain skill level, you don't get to continue past a certain age in some ways. They'll always hire someone younger or somebody more spry. It's when you get to a certain age and you're just so good that they want you there. That's when you get to continue in the film industry. So I definitely felt the ticking of the clock was pushing me and driving me in a way, because I knew that if I got to a certain age, if I wasn't at a certain skill level by a certain age, I wasn't going to work. And that sounds horrible. It sounds horrible. But I also had the double whammy of I was a woman on top of it. And there's always that age and appearance thing that haunts you. As much as you don't want to think about it, as much as you don't want to, consider it, it does. It haunts you. It's a huge part of the hiring process. People look at you and they make assumptions on what you can and can't do. So I've just been trying to push myself to catch up with all these people, and it's not been easy in a vacuum. Portland's a vacuum in some ways. I didn't have a mentor here to teach me. I didn't have anyone in town that I worked for, that I learned from. I never had that. It was just me and it's really sad. It was me in my garage figuring out the basics that most people that pay $30,000 to go to a makeup school can learn in a year. And they're like, it took me 5 years to get to where that makeup student was in a year. But at the same time, I know all the ways it doesn't work. And I have so much on the ground experience, working these indies. I know what happens to certain chemicals in freezing temperatures, and I know what doesn't work, because I've done it and it didn't work. And so there's a lot that I bring to productions, because I've done things. I've done enough shows and enough, things back to back to back to back that I can say, yes, I know what works and doesn't work. And, I have a lot more experience in certain ways. It's just been a real big challenge. And also, I'm poor. I've always been poor. I never came into this with, a funding system. And like I said, that whole thing of me working 2 days where everyone else works 8, over time, cumulatively, it's really challenging to be an effects artist. It's really challenging to be a makeup artist in those kind of times. It's not easy. My words of wisdom to young women wanting to get into the arts or get into the field is be confident. I think something I've really learned about as I've gotten older, and I've started to just step back and observe, is that there's female culture and male culture. That actually has nothing to do with being male or female. I know that sounds insane. But there's there's this structure saying that women are this way, and there's this structure that men are this way. And it doesn't always mean that you are that way. So I see having both female interns and male interns come into my shop and mentoring them and trying to get them to push themselves. What I see most of all is the women are not confident at all. They are very nervous about making mistakes. They're very nervous about upsetting anyone. They're very nervous about raising their voice. And I realized, looking back on my career, I go, I get it. When I've raised my voice or been more aggressive, there's an immediate negative backlash about that, about stay in your place. Don't be aggressive with me. There's definitely a negative reaction to women that are more forceful. So you become very quiet and you become very, in your shell. And my advice, looking back, what I wish I'd done is just been more confident and not waited. I never waited for someone to teach me because I would have been waiting forever. And I see so many young women come in and they're like, teach me everything you know. And I was like, no, you got to go do it. And you've got to get that experience, and because the guys are doing it. They're buying clay and figuring out how to make a monster in their bedroom. Why aren't you buying clay and figuring out a monster in your bedroom? What's the difference? And there's this thing of wanting to be taught, wanting to be guided, not wanting to do anything wrong, and be confident, be willing to make mistakes. So many women are terrified of making mistakes. And you're not going to get any better unless you make mistakes. And I see it as that's the glass ceiling. It's the one we almost impose on ourselves, the be perfect and not make any mistakes. Well, when you try and stay in that mold, then you're not getting out there and being edgy and being creative and, doing sloppy, crazy things that go, look, I came up with a new technique. And that's a huge problem. And I wish more women realized you are good enough. You're just the same as the guys. You're just as good. You just have to be confident enough to say, I want to do this, and just go for it. And stop waiting for someone to show you. Because they're not waiting for someone to show them. So it's a thing. And I know where it comes from. It comes from that whole, wanting to please people and wanting to do the thing in the right order and follow all the proper protocols. And there's this push in female culture to stay in the lane and do everything correctly, but it's not that way in the arts. Nobody gets a gold star for dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. It's more the people that get noticed are the people that are pushing the boundaries and pushing the envelope and trying new things. Those are the people that get noticed. So that would be my advice to young women coming up. And also just recognizing that there's different communication styles. My husband, for example, it takes him so long to get focused on a project that when I come up and say, hey, honey, what do you want for dinner? It throws him completely off, and it takes 10 minutes to get back on track. Well, you're working with a whole crew of people like that. And this is funny. What women don't realize is they have a superpower of multitasking. Somebody can come up and ask me a question, and I can answer it and still continue my work. Not everybody's like that. And a lot of women get resented in the workplace because deeply resented in the workplace because they constantly interrupt people with questions. They're asking questions because they want to do it right. And I just see this massive social penalty for it. And I just advise young women to pay attention, gauge the temperature of the room, and realize that not everybody can get right back on track after being asked a question. So maybe save up your questions or learn more about communication styles going in, and don't assume everyone's like you, because not everyone's like you. You're a unique being that processes things in your own way, and that's okay. But this is the hard discussion that so many people don't want to have. They don't want to admit that maybe there's different types of communication in these workshops, and that what I'm seeing is that women are getting sidelined because of it, and that pains me. I don't want that to happen anymore. So I always advise young women to go for it, but also be careful of communication style and be aware that not everybody has the same kind of brain. So in summary, it's never too late to make art. Because if you looked at my career path, my wild meandering career path through IT work and computer animation and all this wacky stuff I did my whole life has led me to having all the skills I need to do my job today. And if I hadn't had all those adventures, I wouldn't be as effective as a special effects makeup artist. That sounds wacky, but I constantly pull out of my bag of computer animation tricks, advice and tips when I'm on set trying to talk about how we can blend digital and practical effects. My production manager experience. Oh, well, I'm bringing that all into running a trailer. So do not be discouraged if you're mid-30s and you haven't started your art career, because what you don't know is you are gathering a bunch of valuable things. Art is not just art. It's art plus business. It's art plus business. And a lot of people, if you want to make a living being an artist, there's that business, there's that just survival sort of thing that you have to have. And you only get that through living. So don't be discouraged if you're on this meandering, wacky, crazy path going all over the place. Keep your eye on the goal if you want to be doing something creative. Don't be discouraged if you haven't figured it out exactly yet when you're 24 or 25. You may be, like me, gathering all this stuff that ends up coming into one cohesive whole later. I'm 48 now, and I feel like I have such an edge on so many people because of this wacky, wild past I have and this meandering way I did stuff. And I still have lots to do. I want to direct, I want to write, I want to have all these other things. I'm not even close to being done with my creative meanderings. There's no one way to do this. And I think people get so focused on, this is how you become this kind of artist, or this is how you become this kind. No, art is this blend of working very hard on your technical skill set. So when you get the random chance that drops in your lap, you're ready. And nobody wants to hear that, but it's true. It's a wild mix of chaos and planning. And it's okay. That is what art is. It's chaos plus planning.